Larry Barker joins us here in the KRQE News 13 digital studio. Larry, thank you for joining me here.
You bet, Chris.
And we are here to talk about your latest investigation, looking deeper into the recent allegations against now former State Representative Sheryl Williams Stapleton and also their connection to a past investigation. So this is a past investigation, I should add, that you were central in doing. For those catching up, let's just start with, what are the latest allegations against Sheryl Williams Stapleton? What are those latest allegations that are being leveraged against her?
So this is an Attorney General's investigation. It was about a 2-month-long investigation, and back in the end of July is when the Attorney General's office released a search warrant affidavit,
Right.
which kind of detailed what they were looking at. But basically, in a nutshell, the Attorney General alleges that former State Rep William Stapleton committed racketeering, money laundering, receiving kickbacks, and violations of the Governmental Conduct Act.
So it is important to note as well, Larry, that the allegations, of course, against Stapleton, she has not been charged with anything, and she has also adamantly denied wrongdoing in that recent case. So with that recent case in mind, I know a lot of people have been sort of inundated with the news of what happened, but you also had a story with this sort of intersects with this latest investigation that the Attorney General has levied against William Stapleton. Your story goes back to 2012, and I'd like you to kind of give us a recap. At that time, you were looking at what I understand was kind of loads of capital outlay projects that stood out as pork projects. Can you just give me a premise? What was the 2012 investigation? What was the point of that investigation you did?
Sure. This is something we did, it was 9 years ago, but up at the state legislature, this is the way that lawmakers fund pet projects. They call it capital outlay. I think we call it pork.
Right.
But individual legislators are allowed to allocate certain amounts of money for special projects. Now, mostly these are supposed to be for health, safety, and infrastructure types projects. You know, a new road, a new bridge, a dam, a school project, things that would benefit the general public. So our story in 2012 was looking at a number of questionable capital outlay allocations. Now, what's important about capital outlay is that the way this works in New Mexico is individual legislators can allocate, earmark, actually a ton of money to anything they want in their district. And there aren't hearings on these, and there's no legislative vote on the projects. Is just by the nature of their position in the legislature. Both state reps and senators are allowed to allocate funds to really whatever they want. And so our story in 2012 was to highlight a number of these projects.
Yeah. And so looking at some of those projects, there is one in that story. You reported on how these vans had been purchased by, or sort of the vans had been purchased with state funding, and that had come through an Albuquerque legislator. And at the time, the legislator wasn't named. You were looking at several different projects, but you mentioned something funny that happened with this purchase of these vans. Shortly after they were purchased, it sounded like that these vans had their titles transferred to some other entity. In that story, here you are sort of presenting the facts, and then you presented that to then a cabinet secretary, right?
Right. What happened is it was a capital outlay allocation. The sponsor was Representative William Stapleton, and it was $50,000 to purchase 2 passenger vans for the African American Performing Arts Pavilion at the State Fairgrounds in Albuquerque.
Right.
And that's what the bill provided for. 2 passenger vans for the African American Performing Arts Pavilion at the fairgrounds.
Right.
It was $50,000. So, of course, and you see the appropriation on your screen there.
Yeah.
The money was allocated, the vans were purchased. Now remember, this is public money, and it has to be for a public purpose.
Right.
So the vans were to go to this Performing Arts Center at the fairgrounds. Well, after they were purchased, the titles were then mysteriously transferred to a private company.
Right.
And it turns out that that private company was Robotics, which is the connection. Robotics is the same company that the Attorney General alleges was making kickbacks to Representative Williams Stapleton currently. Once those vans, the vans were transferred to Robotics,
right,
that was illegal. That cannot be done. This is public money, and those vans cannot be transferred to a private company. That's exactly what happened. Now, this had happened in 2007. We did our story in 2012. Nobody noticed that these vans had been mysteriously transferred into private hands.
Yeah.
In this case, Robotics.
Yeah.
Now, back when we did the story, it caught everybody off guard. I mean, the Secretary of the Department of Finance at the time said, "Holy cow, we didn't know."
Yeah.
And so that's illegal. The vans were then returned to state custody. A case was referred to the Attorney General's office in 2012, but nothing happened to it. Now, back when we did this story, the name Robotics didn't really mean anything.
Right.
We didn't know anything about the company back then. But once the Attorney General did his investigation this year, and the connection between State Rep William Stapleton and Robotics, once that was spelled out in the court documents, we saw that, and I said, "Holy cow!" We saw the connection between William Stapleton and Robotics 9 years ago.
Yeah. When you referred that sort of finding that these vehicles were transferred into private hands, you had mentioned it was referred to the Attorney General's office. Did you ever hear anything more about where that case went or why anything may or may not have happened?
No, there was a case referred because what had happened was illegal. But we never heard, there was no follow-up, nothing from the Attorney General. There were no charges filed. So, we can't say.
Yeah.
What happened to the case? Well, it's one of those things where it just died. We don't know.
It's interesting, I think, that you brought that up at the time, because I think some people may look at that story and say, man, there were red flags long ago, years ago. Is that kind of how you feel as just an investigative reporter, that having reported that information and knowing that something happened in the time, we're not really sure what happened to the case, but is that kind of how you feel as an investigative reporter, is that, man, there were some red flags, we raised them as much as we could at that time, but it's interesting to never know exactly what happened out of that?
It is interesting, Chris. I would say that what happened with this case 9 years ago was a red flag, but I think you have to put it all into context.
Right.
This was a single capital outlay appropriation. It was $50,000. Now, in the scheme of things, when you're talking about the legislature and capital outlay, $50,000, I hate to admit this, but it's a drop in the bucket as far as legislators are concerned.
That's true.
I mean,
yeah.
they're talking millions and millions and sometimes billions of dollars.
Right.
So $50,000, a couple of vans that ended up in the wrong place. It's and then back then we didn't know anything about robotics.
Right.
So you got to fast forward to today and the current investigation. You know, the association of Williams Stapleton and robotics, according to the Attorney General's allegations, are that she took in as almost $1 million in payments that were supposed to go to robotics.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of money. The Attorney General's investigation, this search warrant affidavit, is fascinating reading in terms of the evidence that they have uncovered so far. They are allegations at this point. She's not been charged with a crime to date, but it is compelling reading, I've got to say. So you got to put it in perspective.
Certainly. Well, I wanted to ask you one final question about kind of where we go from here, because this is an interesting thing that you sort of brought back to light here, is that, hey, this happened many years ago, and it definitely has a connection now of interest as the Attorney General's investigation unfolds. My question to you being, do you know what is next for this investigation? Maybe what are you hearing about sort of where things go for this William Stapleton investigation?
Well, so far the only thing publicly is the filing of these court documents. It's a search warrant affidavit. It's a lengthy document that kind of spells out the Attorney General's investigation and their findings. So the next step is going to be for the Attorney General to review the evidence in the case and see if there is enough evidence to go for a grand jury indictment. If the grand jury indicts, then those are formal charges, and then that would really set a case in motion. My understanding is that there are a number of federal agencies that are also investigating improprieties involving former state rep William Stapleton. We don't know a lot of details of exactly what they're looking at or when we might hear more about that. It's pending. Yeah. But there are a number of investigations. They have not filed charges, but it's one of those things where you just stay tuned.
Yeah.
Because it looks like it's coming.
Yeah, that's certainly a very big case, and I think, as you had mentioned as well, very interesting reading to hear the filings that the Attorney General has put forward already. Larry Barker, thank you so much for joining us here. We appreciate your investigative reporting, and thanks again for sharing some time with us to talk a little bit more deeply about how you do this work.
Great. Thank you, Chris.